Over 11 million people died in Nazi concentration camps during World War II. These were men, women, and children who perished from starvation, torture, disease, or were murdered in gas chambers. A large portion of these deaths were the work of just a few individuals who commanded the most terrifying death camps. These SS commandants created factories of death where thousands of people were annihilated daily. In their hands, the devaluation of human life became a cold, planned process. They ran the camps that went down in history as the deadliest places on Earth. Subscribe to the channel to join in uncovering the truth the Nazis wanted to erase forever. The history and functioning of concentration camps. An overview. To understand the fates of the men who ran this machine of death, one must first look at the machine itself. The Nazi concentration camp system didn't appear overnight. It was born gradually, mutating from an instrument of political terror into an unprecedented industry of genocide that became the darkest symbol of the 20th century. It all began almost immediately after Adolf Hitler became chancellor in January 1933. On March 22, the first model concentration camp, Dachau, opened near Munich. Its initial purpose was pragmatic and cruel, to isolate, break, and intimidate the regime's political opponents. The first prisoners of Dachau were not Jews or foreigners, but Germans themselves, communists, social democrats, trade unionists, and monarchists, anyone who might organize resistance against the new government. This was a clear and terrifying signal to the rest of Germany. Any dissent would be crushed in its infancy. The camps became a visible embodiment of fear, a place where one could disappear without a trace for an incautious word or a sideways glance. Over the years, the system grew like a cancerous tumor. Under the watchful eye of Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler and his office, the network of camps transformed into a centralized empire of terror. New camps appeared: Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, and Ravensbrück. Their function began to change. After Kristallnacht in 1938, Jews started to be sent to the camps en masse. With the outbreak of World War II, the geography and composition of the prisoners expanded to an unimaginable scale. Now they were not only political opponents, but also those whom Nazi ideology considered inferior or undesirable elements. Jews from all over Europe, Roma, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Slavs, prisoners of war, the mentally ill, and the disabled. The goal evolved from re-education to total economic exploitation, and ultimately to physical extermination. On the gates of Auschwitz hung the cynical inscription, Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. But in reality, it was a concept of extermination through labor. The culmination of this evolution was the final solution to the Jewish question, a plan for the systematic murder of millions of people, for which specialized death camps were created, such as Treblinka, Sobibor, and Chełmno, which functioned as genuine factories of death. At the top of each camp's hierarchy stood the commandant, the absolute master of life and death for thousands, and sometimes hundreds of thousands, of people. Officers and SS guards reported to him, but one of the most horrifying features of the system was the involvement of the prisoners themselves in the administration. Kapos, mostly criminal prisoners, were given power over other inmates in exchange for privileges. They often surpassed the SS in their cruelty to prove their loyalty. The life of a prisoner was a hell on earth. Wooden barracks were overcrowded, with people sleeping on triple-tiered bunks, often several to a spot. Starvation was chronic. The daily ration consisted of slop, watery soup made from rotten vegetables, a piece of bread with sawdust, and acorn coffee. Poor sanitation led to epidemics of typhus, dysentery, and cholera. Each day began with an exhausting roll call that lasted for hours in any weather. Then came 12 hours of slave labor in factories, quarries, or on construction sites. Any offense or sign of disobedience was punished with torture or death. Prisoners were deprived not only of their freedom, but also of their identity. Instead of a name, they were given a number tattooed on their arm. It was a system designed for complete dehumanization, and at the very heart of this empire of horror were the men who turned an ideology into an industry of death. One of the most efficient architects of this hell was Rudolf Höss. Rudolf Höss, architect of Auschwitz. The name of Rudolf Höss is forever inscribed in history as a synonym for Auschwitz. He was not a sadistic psychopath in the classic sense. He was a bureaucrat, a meticulous executor who turned mass murder into an efficient conveyor belt. His story is the journey of a dedicated soldier who became the most bloodthirsty manager in human history. Born in 1900 to a devout Catholic family, Rudolf was raised in an atmosphere of strict discipline from childhood. His father wanted him to become a priest, but World War I changed everything. At 15, lying about his age, Höss volunteered for the front. He fought in the Middle East, was wounded, received the Iron Cross, and rose to the rank of non-commissioned officer. The war hardened him and, at the same time, left him empty. Returning to Germany, he found no place for himself in peacetime. Like many veterans, he joined the ultra-right paramilitary groups known as the Freikorps. In 1922, he heard a speech by Hitler and, in his own words, found a new leader to whom he swore loyalty. He joined the NSDAP, took part in the Beer Hall Putsch, and was jailed with Hitler. In 1934, on Himmler's recommendation, he joined the SS and was assigned to the Dachau concentration camp. There, under the command of Theodor Eicke, he went through his School of Cruelty and learned the system's main principle: no compassion. His organizational skills and ideological steadfastness were noticed. In May 1940, he received a fateful appointment to become the commandant of a new camp established near the Polish town of Oświęcim. This camp was given the German name Auschwitz. Under Höss's leadership, Auschwitz was transformed from a camp for Polish prisoners of war into the largest extermination complex in history. It was Höss, seeking a more efficient method of killing than firing squads, who introduced the use of the pesticide Zyklon B. He personally supervised the construction of the gas chambers and crematoria, calculating their capacity like an engineer calculating a factory's output. In his post-war testimony, he coldly stated, "By my calculations, about 2.5 million people were exterminated in Auschwitz by gassing and burning, and at least another 500,000 died from starvation and disease. Thus, the total number of deaths is about 3 million. He was proud of his work, believing he had carried out the Führer's orders with maximum efficiency. When Germany's defeat became obvious, Höss, like thousands of other Nazis, disappeared. He lived under the assumed name of Franz Lang and worked as a farmer in northern Germany. However, Nazi hunters were on his trail. In March 1946, he was arrested by British military police. At first, he denied everything, but when his wife threatened to turn him over to the Russians, he surrendered and gave his real name. Höss became a key witness at the Nuremberg Trials. His calm, detailed testimony about the mechanics of Auschwitz shocked even seasoned lawyers. He showed no remorse, merely stating facts. After Nuremberg, he was handed over to Poland. His trial in Warsaw was short. The verdict was obvious: death by hanging. On April 16, 1947, Rudolf Höss was brought to the grounds of the camp he had commanded. The gallows were built next to Crematorium Dar, the very one he had designed. The architect of Auschwitz was hanged at the site of his greatest crime, Amon Göth, the butcher of Płaszów. If Rudolf Höss was a cold-blooded bureaucrat of death who turned murder into a conveyor belt, there were others for whom cruelty was not just a job, but a genuine pleasure. A prime example of such a sadist was Amon Göth, whose name became the personification of a vile, sadistic form of evil. He didn't just follow orders, he reveled in power, suffering, and murder. Born in 1908 in Vienna to a wealthy family of publishers, Göth was captivated by Nazi ideas from a young age. At 22, he joined the Austrian branch of the NSDAP and soon after, the SS. His career in the SS before the war was marked by participation in terrorist acts and underground activities in Austria, which forced him to flee to Germany. He was known for his explosive temper, drunkenness, and pathological cruelty long before he was given unlimited power over people. Göth's moment arrived in February 1943 when he was appointed commandant of the Płaszów concentration camp, located on the outskirts of Kraków. It was he who directed the brutal liquidation of the Kraków ghetto in March 1943, personally shooting women and children in the streets. At Płaszów, Göth turned the prisoners' lives into a constant game of Russian roulette. His villa stood on a hill overlooking the camp. As eerily depicted in the film Schindler's List, he would often step out onto his balcony with a sniper rifle and shoot at prisoners working below for sport. No prisoner could feel safe. Göth could kill someone for working too slowly, in his opinion, or simply because he was in a bad mood. He would set his two massive dogs, Ralph and Rolf, on people, and they would tear their victims to pieces. According to survivors, he would hold parties during which he might bring out a few prisoners and kill them in front of his guests. He was the absolute embodiment of sadism, drunk on blood and limitless power. Even for the SS, Göth's cruelty and, more importantly, his corruption were excessive. He was stealing vast quantities of Jewish property. In September 1944, he was arrested by the Gestapo. They were planning to try him for embezzlement of state property, but the end of the war prevented the process. In May 1945, he was arrested by American troops. He tried to pass himself off as a regular Wehrmacht soldier, but former Płaszów prisoners identified him. He was extradited to Poland. The trial of the Butcher of Płaszów took place in Kraków. Hundreds of witnesses testified about his atrocities. Göth was defiant, denying everything. He was sentenced to death by hanging. On September 13, 1946, the sentence was carried out. Legend has it that the executioner failed 3 times to properly secure the rope, and only on the 3rd attempt did Göth die. His last words before his death were, "Heil Hitler, Josef Kramer, the beast of Bergen-Belsen." But cruelty had many faces. If Göth killed for fun, other commandants achieved the same result through their absolute indifference. They created conditions in which death from starvation and disease became inevitable. And no one personified this cold, passive deadliness better than Josef Kramer, known as the Beast of Belsen. Born in 1906, Kramer was a typical representative of the old guard of the Nazis. He joined the party in 1931 and the SS in 1932. He had no higher education and worked as an accountant, but the concentration camp system opened up career prospects for him. He followed the classic SS path, service at Dachau, then Sachsenhausen and Mauthausen. He was Rudolf Höss's adjutant at Auschwitz, where he earned a reputation as a cruel and effective executor. In May 1944, Kramer reached the peak of his career, becoming the commandant of the gas chambers and crematoria at Auschwitz-Birkenau. He was personally responsible for the selection of newly arrived prisoners, deciding who would live and who would die immediately. But he earned his nickname later, in December 1944, when he was transferred to the position of commandant of the Bergen-Belsen camp. This camp was not a death camp with gas chambers, but under Kramer's leadership, it became a place where death was even more horrifying, slow and painful. At the end of the war, thousands of prisoners from other camps being evacuated ahead of the Allied advance were brought to Belsen. The camp was catastrophically overcrowded. Kramer did absolutely nothing to provide people with food, water, or medical care. A terrible typhus epidemic began. People died by the thousands from starvation and disease. Cannibalism became commonplace. Kramer calmly observed this, claiming he was only following orders and had no resources. His indifference was as deadly as Zyklon B gas. On April 15, 1945, British troops entered the camp. The newsreel footage filmed then, which showed a scene of hell with piles of bodies and tens of thousands of living skeletons, went around the world and became one of the most terrifying symbols of the Holocaust. Kramer was arrested on the spot. He didn't try to flee. During interrogations, he acted calmly and even with a certain sense of injury, as if he were just a soldier doing his duty. He became the main defendant at the Belsen trial in Nuremberg. The trial of him and 44 other camp staff members was the first major trial of Nazi criminals. Dozens of survivors testified against him. He was sentenced to death. On December 13, 1945, at Hameln Prison, the famous British executioner Albert Pierrepoint carried out the sentence. The Beast of Belsen met his death just as coldly as he had sent thousands of his victims to theirs. Karl-Otto Koch, the commandant executed by his own people. If Josef Kramer entered history as the cold and indifferent Beast of Belsen, Karl-Otto Koch became infamous for something entirely different: boundless greed, abuse of power, and corruption that shocked even the SS. His story is a rare case where a concentration camp commandant was executed not by his enemies, but by his own masters. A World War I veteran with a criminal past, Koch found a social ladder in Nazism. He joined the NSDAP and the SS in 1931. His cruelty, determination, and lack of moral inhibitions quickly attracted the attention of the leadership. He was one of the first officers to shape the concentration camp system. He was the commandant of Sachsenhausen-Buchenwald, 1937-1941, and Majdanek, 1941-1942. Koch was a sadist in the purest sense. He personally participated in torture and executions. By his order, a riding arena was built at Buchenwald, for which money was taken from the prisoners. But his main partner in crime was his wife, Ilse Koch, nicknamed the Witch of Buchenwald by the prisoners. She was known for her cruelty and perverse fantasies. The most famous myth associated with her is the making of lampshades, gloves, and book covers from the skin of murdered prisoners, especially those with interesting tattoos. Although direct evidence of the existence of the lampshades was not found, the fact that she collected pieces of skin with tattoos was confirmed. The Koch couple turned Buchenwald into their feudal domain, where they not only tormented people but also enriched themselves endlessly. They stole money, gold, jewelry, and any valuables taken from the prisoners. Their corruption reached such a scale that the SS leadership became interested. An investigation against Koch began in 1941. He was accused of embezzlement, corruption, and murder, but not the murder of thousands of prisoners. That didn't concern anyone. He was accused of murdering a few prisoner witnesses who could have testified about his financial machinations. For a time, the case was hushed up, and he was transferred to become commandant of Majdanek. However, in 1943, the investigation was reopened. This time, there was sufficient evidence. In August 1944, Karl and Ilse Koch were arrested by the Gestapo. An SS court found Karl Koch guilty of corruption, inciting murder, and disgracing the uniform of the SS. The sentence was death. Ilse Koch was acquitted for lack of evidence. She would be sentenced after the war. On April 5, 1945, just a week before American troops liberated Buchenwald, Karl-Otto Koch was shot in the courtyard of the very camp where he had once been the absolute master. The system devoured its own monsters, not for their inhumanity, but for failing to follow its internal rules of corruption. The fates of these men, Rudolf Höss, Amon Göth, Josef Kramer, Franz Stangl, and Karl Koch, were different, but they all ended the same way. They, who considered themselves superhuman masters of life and death, eventually faced justice. Some faced the justice of the victors, some faced the justice of their own system, and some faced the justice of history, which continues to this day. Their stories are not just tales of monsters. They are a terrible warning about how ordinary people, bureaucrats, soldiers, police officers, can become the perpetrators of the most horrific crimes, justifying themselves with orders, ideology, or their own indifference. The Nuremberg Trials and subsequent courts established the most important principle: "I was only following orders," is not a justification for crimes against humanity. Everyone bears personal responsibility for their actions. The punishment of these criminals was not an act of revenge, but an attempt to restore justice, as much as that is even possible after such a catastrophe. It was a signal to future generations that genocide and mass murder would be held accountable. Therefore, our duty is to remember. To remember not only the millions of innocent victims, but also those who were behind their suffering. To remember the mechanisms that turn people into executioners. To remember, so that we never again allow darkness to swallow the world, because the power of memory is the only vaccine against history repeating itself.